What's up, everybody? It's Bloody Bill Vox coming at you one more time for some Dropkicks and Joysticks. It's episode number 6. Kind of rhymed a little bit, didn't it? But welcome back once again. Last week we covered WrestleFest. This week we're going to cover something off the mainstream path, if you will. But before we get into that, let's cover a little bit of housekeeping. If you'd like to keep up with me and all of my antics on social media, you can follow me across many different channels at Bloody Bill Vox. I recently got rid of Kick and I deactivated Threads. I can't be bothered with trying to crack into a new social media network, and that's with regards to Threads. And then as far as broadcasting, at this particular point in time, I can't be bothered with trying to crack into another site, especially one that has had a number of reported security breaches as of late. So no longer will you find me on Kick or Threads. You can find me on Twitch, YouTube, Twitter, or now it's X, I guess, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, the PlayStation Network, Ko-fi, Teespring, and, of course, Spotify. At Bloody Bill Vox, except for on Spotify. And if you're listening on Spotify, you already know that Bloody Bill Vox is not how you find it. It's Dropkicks and Joysticks. But as we record this episode, just a few days removed from SummerSlam 2023, did a full breakdown of sorts. I say of sorts because I have a little fuzzy brain on some of the details, but I did a breakdown of sorts over on Twitch at twitch.tv/BloodyBillVox. I'd say the biggest talking points coming out of SummerSlam were easily the Io Sky cash-in, the Brock Lesnar nod of approval to Cody Rhodes, and the head-scratcher of a turn by Jimmy Uso on Jay. The Bloodline story has been easily one of the best WWE has pulled out of their hat in a very, very long time. So I'm willing to give some sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Benefit of doubt. There we go. And not even word, phrase. I'm willing to give some benefit of doubt on this one and say maybe they know what they're doing here. But this just seems to not make any sense. They're going to have to talk and explain really, really heavy why, after everything that's gone down, why Jimmy Uso was motivated to turn on his brother. I'm not quite sure, as I sit here today, that I can even really wrap my head around it. The idea that, Jimmy might be upset about the beatdowns. Well, Jay took some beatdown also. Maybe not as bad, but, it was Jimmy that kind of initiated everything to begin with. He's the one who kicked Roman back when he kicked him. What was it, Night of Champions? I think it was in Saudi. I've seen some argument that maybe he was so jealous at the idea of Jay becoming the tribal chief that he was willing to stop it, even if it meant helping Roman. And that's a theory I could see supported, because Jimmy didn't stick around and celebrate, and Roman looked very surprised by everything. So it'll be interesting to see what they do as an explanation as to what his motivation was, why he was motivated in that way to attack his brother like that. I don't know. Those couple of reasons I gave they're too easy. They're cop-out reasons in my book. Why after everything? I don't get it. Unless the only thing that I could think of as I'm sitting here, because one phrase that Jimmy Uso has repeatedly uttered is, "He ain't your brother, I'm your brother, listen to me, I got you." Maybe somewhere along the way, Jimmy feels Jay stopped listening to him. I don't know. But as this episode is recorded, we're a few days away from Friday Night SmackDown, which is where we'll get some of the starter answers. A lot of people speculate we'll have Jimmy versus Jay at Payback on September 2nd. But I don't know if they'll rush right into it. But who knows? It's such a head-scratcher. Overall, SummerSlam was an okay show. I don't sit here today being all wowed by really too much that happened. It was good, but it wasn't great. In a year that WWE has had a lot of stellar pay-per-views, premium live events, whatever you want to call them, this one, I don't know, felt off. My least favorites of the night were definitely the Slim Jim Battle Royal because there was no stakes involved. Like, who cares? Yes, it was an LA Knight driver. But other than that, what were the stakes? Why are we just doing a battle royal for the sake of doing a battle royal? Because what, Slim Jim is sponsoring? All right, well, I'm pretty sure during the women's match they decked out the entire ring and everything in C4 Energy stuff. So I think we could have sponsored another match and not done a battle royal. I don't know. But yeah, I speaking of that women's match, I didn't care for that one. I didn't care for the battle royal. Seth and Finn was good. The drama with Judgment Day continues to unfold there. So, if you haven't seen SummerSlam at this point, and you have Peacock or the WWE Network, I'd say sit down and be ready to skip around. Maybe skip into the matches. Not a lot. Some of them start slow. The MMA rules match kind of lost everybody. It wasn't, I think, what anybody was expecting, but I also don't think any of us knew what to expect. Anyway, enough of that. So again, like I said, I say enough of that, but closing remarks is, if you got the time, it's worth a rewatch, at least to kind of see it as it unfolded versus listening to me or any other people talk about it. But before I get into the topic of discussion, I thought I had another little housekeeping thing to talk about. But I don't think I do. Because I don't have any other notes written down here, because I've started to get very good about making notes for this show. I got 4 pages of notes, or 3 pages, excuse me. I thought I had another page stuck here. I got 3 pages for today on our episode feature. So let's get into it, since there is no additional item. If there is, I'll remember it later. That's the beauty of concussions and memory issues and post-traumatic stress. It can really mess with your memory. So it may come back. It may not have even been there to begin with. That's the beauty of me. Anyway, let's officially get into it. This week's featured title, there it is on your screen, Power Move Pro Wrestling. Released in November of 1996, on the 14th to be precise. It was published by Activision. It was developed by Ukes. And thanks to SmackDownHotel.com, we can also report that it had over 58 authentic pro wrestling moves and combos. That's such a weird number, over 58. Makes me wonder, was it just 59? Because why 58? Why would you say 58? Wouldn't you just say over 55? If it's not over 60, but it's over 55? I don't know. It says, choose from wrestlers around the world. View the real motion 3D mayhem from multiple angles. And, of course, it was based on the #1 wrestling game in Japan, Toukon Retsuden. I probably butchered that, but, that's what I do. Originally, it was thought that this game was going to just be a domestic release of Retsuden, because this game basically came out in Japan first in 1995 under the New Japan banner. And actually, when you start this game up, you can see on the start screen, and we've already passed it by now in the video on YouTube, but if you noticed, there's a copyright New Japan down on the lower left side of the screen, kind of center oriented, but left side of what was at the bottom. So you could tell that this game had New Japan somewhere involved in it. And something that I never even noticed until I was firing it up and doing my research for this episode, the Power Move Pro Wrestling logo on the main screen is basically the New Japan Pro Wrestling logo, but changed for this game. And I really tried to find precisely why this game went from being a New Japan Pro Wrestling title to being a Power Move Pro Wrestling title, which is a non-existent promotion, essentially. Why did we pivot from New Japan Pro Wrestling to unlicensed, no-name characters? The only thing that I could find, and I found this in a number of different places, but the only thing that I could truly find is that there was worry that New Japan Pro Wrestling was not popular enough outside of Japan for that game to be released under the New Japan Pro Wrestling banner and be successful in North America. Given at the time in 1996, the major spotlight for New Japan Pro Wrestling in the United States was via WCW, who was the very distant number 2. Here in November of 1996, they're starting to go head-to-head much tighter with the World Wrestling Federation, but in the window of which they would have likely been promoting this game, it may not have been as safe of a bet to say, oh, well, WCW uses our New Japan guys, and so that's kind of how we can, utilize that platform to help sell this game. So my theory based on my reading is that rather than risk having New Japan have a failed title in the United States, Activision and Ukes with New Japan Pro Wrestling, because their name is still included in the game, it's almost like they decided to just rebrand the game completely. And that's exactly what they did. Because this game is, as I said before, it's unlicensed. In the sense that there's no promotion behind it. Obviously, Ukes and Activision are real companies, and it was, licensed in that manner, but, there's no WWF, there's no WCW, there's no ECW behind it. It's a standalone wrestling game, which at the time, for the PlayStation, I believe it was the first and maybe among the only domestically to be released without the backing of a mainstream brand. Of course, WWF had all their games, WCW had all their games, ECW even later had their games. But domestically speaking, the only wrestling games outside of branded that I can think of, and, I'm pretty sure I have all the domestic PlayStation 1 titles, but the only non-branded titles that existed for the PlayStation 1 in the history of the console, mind you, Power Move Pro Wrestling and The Simpsons Wrestling. Power Move Pro Wrestling being the first. And since I didn't think about this point ahead of time, we're doing some quick research on the fly right now to see when the Simpsons Wrestling game was released. In relation to, that game was not even released until 2001. So we're talking a 5-year window where every other wrestling game on the PlayStation 1 domestically, in North America, mind you, was backed by some sort of mainstream brand. For me, I remember this game either being a Christmas gift or buying it with my Christmas money, but my memory is feeling more that it was a Christmas gift. And the reason being is my family didn't always necessarily understand what wrestling was or who wrestled where, who wrestled under what names. To them, wrestling was just wrestling. You know, a lot of them, to them, wrestling was WWF. Didn't matter what you were watching. Oh, you watching that WWF stuff? That was always the sentiment that was thrown down about it. So I feel like my mother, in her any wrestling is good wrestling when it comes to my fandom, because she would just get me anything related to wrestling, whether it was WWF or not. My memory is telling me that this game was one of those deals where it was getting a wrestling game for the sake of getting a wrestling game. So, assuming that she got this for me as a Christmas gift, this was probably a Christmas of '96 gift. And in 1996, I was already starting to be familiar with the bootleg wrestling music, because I had been duped at a Best Buy into buying an album that I thought was actual WWF and WCW theme music, but it turned out to be some third-party knockoff business. So when I got this game, Power Move Pro Wrestling, I thought that it was just going to be some game that was trying to be a mix of WWF and WCW, because at this point in 1996, I was still about 6 months away from learning about ECW in depth. And you could say, oh, but what about the 1997 episode of Monday Night Raw where they invaded at the Manhattan Center? I didn't look any further into ECW. So I wasn't really sure what was going on, and it wasn't the first time WWE or WWF had included another promotion. So in 96, I'm like, let's say about a good 6 to 8 months away from discovering ECW late at night on a Spanish language channel, of all places to discover it. But they sold their overnight air to anybody that wanted to buy it. So it could be English speaking programming in their off hours. But anyway, I digress from that point about when I discovered ECW. When I got this game, I assumed that it was just going to be bootleg WWF, WCW, basically. And when I look back at some of these characters, I remember specifically playing with Area 51 because he reminded me of Sting. I was like, oh, that's Sting. And there were a few guys I probably could have argued reminded me of Sting. But ultimately, what these characters were is they were original characters, but they maintained the movesets of the guys from the New Japan game. So let's talk about what the roster was when it was in Japan and what the roster became when the game was rebooted. So New Japan Pro Wrestling was the banner when it came out in 1995 in Japan. And this was the roster, and I will butcher some of the names, of course, but we'll do our very best. The roster for the New Japan version of this game was Tatsumi Fujinami, Riki Koshu, Keiji Muda, the Great Muda, Masahiro Chono, Shinya Hashimoto, Hiroshi Hashi, Kensuke Sasaki, or the Power Warrior. Here we go. Here's going to be a big-time butchering. Shiro Koshinaka. Maybe not so bad. Jushin Thunder Liger. Hiroshi Tenzan. And it says in parentheses, Kiro-chan. Koji Kanemoto or Tiger Hattori. And Scott Norton. That was the roster for the New Japan version. By the time we get ourselves over to North America, check out some of these names we get. We get Agent Orange, Area 51, Chain Gang, The Commandant, The Judge, Danny McGee, The Egyptian Conniption, El Tremblor, Gorgon, King Og, Lance Duloc, Malibu Mike Swanson, Sally, Sparrow, and Zombie. Whew. That was a terrible whistle, but you get the point. From my notes here, I can see that Gorgon, Sally, and Sparrow are hidden. You have to put in some special code work. Now, check out, I actually copy and pasted the entire thing. So, it says at the title screen, here's what you put in to unlock Gorgon. L1, L1, L2, R2, R2, R1, triangle, down, X, up, select. And then when you get to the character screen, you hit select when you get to Agent Orange. But dear geez, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 buttons. 11 damn buttons. Before you are able to unlock the legendary Gorgon. For a game that was as limited as it was, it had enough modes to really get you by, in my opinion. We had 1-player and 2-player modes, or you could do the demo match, which it would be watching the computer play against each other. You could do a 12-man gauntlet, which was, as the name entails, facing 12 opponents in a row. You could fight for the PPW Championship, Power Move Pro Wrestling Championship. You could play in a Power Move Pro Wrestling League or the PPW League. This is a round-robin tournament with the wrestler with the most points at the end winning. Sounds a little bit like a New Japan concept, does it? We'll get to what the original concepts were in a second. We've also got the PPW Tournament. It's a single elimination tournament mode, and we can save our progress and resume it later. And that's the cool thing about all of the modes in this is you can save and resume later. Sometimes you have to play a mode, and you have to finish it in one sitting, or you lose your progress. We have resume progress options here, which I always thought was nice, because sometimes as a kid, and even still as an adult, I don't always have the attention span to sit and play a game for a super long time. So I would bounce around from game to game to game. And any game that allowed me to resume, fantastic. So I played a lot of games too where it didn't matter if you stopped. So like, basketball, baseball, football, one game exhibition style, it's all good. But Power Move Pro Wrestling allowed the restart ability. I don't even think that's a word, but I used it. To hell with it. I'm using it. It's mine. Allowed restart ability. Restart, resume. There we go. Resume's a better word. Makes me sound a little less stupid. Dummy. You big dummy. What are you doing? You're being a big dummy. Yeah, buddy. Stupid. What? Huh? Anyway. So those were our game modes. What a goober. What a goober I am. So basically, in short, exhibition matches, gauntlet matches, championship matches, league matches, and tournament matches. Now, that's all sounds nice and well, but what would it have been, what would the names have been, had we gotten the New Japan game? So let's go through that. We don't necessarily need to rehash the exhibition thing, but same setup. 1, 2, or demo. Then we would have had the IWGP Senshu Kenshai. That's my best attempt. Where you would fight to become the IWGP champion. Oh, excuse me, I skipped one. Here we go. Shiren no Juniban Shobu. Wow. It says the New Japan Pro Wrestling Challenge is a contest. Oh, okay. So apparently that was the translation. New Japan Pro Wrestling Challenge is a contest against all the other wrestlers of New Japan Pro Wrestling. Your opponents are selected at random. Kind of sounds a lot like the 12-man gauntlet. So before, when I said PPW League, round robin, most points, sound familiar? Well, maybe the G1 Climax League will sound familiar to you. And this one goes into a little bit of detail where I believe the details were the same for the Power Move Pro Wrestling. But it says you're set up in a grueling league mode in which you will wrestle every other wrestler. You're awarded points for winning 2 or drawing 1. If you lose, no points. 2 wrestlers with the most points at the end wrestle each other to determine the overall league winner. Then, of course, we have the G1 Climax Tournament, which would pair up with the Power Move Pro Wrestling Tournament. And they listed for the features of the New Japan version, the demo match is actually listed as the final mode. So we had 4 different difficulty levels in this one. Easy, medium, hard, and wow. I probably played the most on easy and medium. I've never really been crazy big into high difficulties, partially because I'm not good at them. The other reason being, I believe video games should be fun for you, so, play them on any level. I know some people love to level shame somebody based on a level they play their game on, whether it's easy, whether it's medium, they play with cheats, they play with hacks. I think as long as you're not in a situation where your skills are dependent upon, winning, say, money or positions, using, I don't know, Call of Duty, for example, when a cheater gets outed at like a $250,000 tournament thing. Yeah, that's when you should be good at these games. And if people want to be that type of competitive player, then all the power to you to play on hard and super hard and punch you in the nuts while you play hard, whatever. To each their own on that one. But I remember definitely playing it on the easy and medium. Most of these gameplay videos, I will tell you, if they're not being simulated by the game and I am playing them, they're probably on easy. Because why would I want to be frustrated while I'm recording gameplay to share with everybody? Why would I want to be frustrated with that? That makes no sense. Other times I'll leave it on the default setting. It all depends on how difficult the game is for me. In many cases, I'm picking these games up for the first time in, 20, 30 years. Wow. That just punched me in the gut. I was like, no way. There can't be any games that I'm picking up for the first time in 30 years. Yes, there can. I mean, there are no games that I played in 1993 that I haven't played since then. But the fact remains is there are games that I have played and will talk about that are 30 years old. In fact, Power Move Pro Wrestling turns 27 years old this year. I'm getting old. Further adjustments to the game modes itself, though, getting back on that topic, we can adjust the time limit, whether draws are allowed. We had 4 different venues, which was the Dome, Vito's, Croc, or Slamrock. I love the Dome because it reminded me of the Tokyo Dome. I was familiar with New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1996, thanks to WCW, but that's just the kind of wrestling fan I was. I have to admit, though, that it's very reasonable to think that in 1996, the New Japan brand would not have done well selling domestically in the United States, where their only exposure at that point was via WCW television, and they were going to be marketing their own video games in the space. So at that point, New Japan becomes competition. And I don't think that's what they wanted at all, was competition between those 2 different brands. You could also change the camera view to be first or second floor. And then, of course, you could adjust your sound to be stereo or mono. Playing it on mono always made me feel like my ears were plugged, because I always wondered why you would do that. I guess single speaker TVs, that would make sense. And I did have a single speaker TV, and that's why I tried it, but it sounded weird. But yeah, so those are the various things that you could do in terms of customizing your matches and your gameplay. As I said before, I remember getting this game as a Christmas gift. With some of the other ones that I've talked about so far, and we'll talk about in the future, I'll be fuzzy. Did I get it for Christmas? Did I buy it with Christmas money? I feel like this one was probably bought for Christmas. I imagine it probably was not all that expensive because it wasn't a WWF, WCW, ECW game, and these video games were expensive, so, you know, we would always try to find deals. Even when I was buying them for myself, I very rarely wanted to pay full price for any game back then. So you wait for sales or you buy off-brand stuff if you could. So that's what I feel like was probably the rationale behind that, because, you know, we had the Christmas that was all WWF stuff. And funny enough, I did the dates out for the rest of 2023 for this show. I was kind of looking at episode numbers, and I was planning out the next so many episodes. In fact, I've already decided what the 7, 8, 9, and 10 are going to be. But I've already decided that in December, the episode that will actually drop on Christmas Day will not cover a video game or a wrestling event. I'm going to talk about the wrestling Christmas that was 1991 or 92. We'll have to get 91. We'll get firm on that one for sure, though. But I'm pretty sure it was 91. But that episode, I'll talk about that one in depth. But I just remember after that Christmas, it was anything and everything wrestling. So that's why my brain continues to default to this idea that it had to be from my mother, because she was always trying to increase how much wrestling she could pump into my veins, so to speak. Another fun note about this game is it's the only game that I've ever been aware of that you could tap out. Like, you could quit. I don't want to play anymore? Submit. Like, that you could do that. I don't know why. I thought that was the coolest shit ever. You get bored with a match, or maybe you just can't beat the guy and he's not trying to beat you, so he puts you in a submission. You forget what buttons you had to press. But to be able to submit without, like, doing this start and quit thing, I thought was cool. I don't know if that was present in the Japanese version of the game. I've only in recent years just started dabbling in international titles. Obviously, the language barrier is a big, challenge, but, as I start to think and, revisit some of these things, I'm like, oh, surely somebody out there has translated what each menu is and whatnot. So I'm slowly looking for that kind of stuff and slowly getting into it. So I don't know if the tap out submission function was in the Retsuden version of this game. But either way, I thought it was a fun little feature. I'd already talked about it earlier today, but even though it said, copyright New Japan Pro Wrestling in the title screen or on the title screen, I didn't know until years later this was New Japan Pro Wrestling at its base, but rebranded for a North American audience that was likely to not accept New Japan Pro Wrestling as a wrestling game. Now, I think looking back on it, if the game had been a flop, it would have certainly hurt New Japan Pro Wrestling, but considering how slow their entry into the United States has been, I almost feel like It wouldn't have mattered if that game flopped, and if it did really good, they would have had another place to release their games for gamers to play them. But it's also fun still, though, to look back and say, what if that game had been released? Because I knew about New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1996. I didn't know who their champions were, but I knew what the Tokyo Dome was. I knew what, their big January show was. I didn't know that it was called Wrestle Kingdom, but I knew that every January, 4th, essentially, it felt like, they ran what felt like a Japanese version of a WrestleMania. I knew about Jushin Thunder Liger. I knew about the Great Muta. I knew about Masahiro Chono. I knew about a couple of other ones. Let's see. Go back to the list here. I knew about Kensuke Sasaki because he had been in WCW. Hashimoto, I knew about him a little bit. Kane Moto, I knew about him a little bit. Hiroshi Tenzan. So, I would have been aces. Tatsumi Fujinami main evented the first Starrcade. Super Brawl pay-per-view with Ric Flair. So for me, as a wrestling fan, if you had released this as a New Japan Pro Wrestling game, I would have been all over it. I would have been all over it either way if I wasn't being given it as a gift, because that's how into wrestling I was, especially in 1996. But if it had been New Japan Pro Wrestling, that would have been so great, because, Dome might have actually been called the Tokyo Dome. We would have seen those G1 Climax references. We might have even seen Wrestle Kingdom as a reference for the event. So it's fun to look back on it and speculate, what could have been. And of course, New Japan Pro Wrestling kind of re-entered in a major fashion with the Fire Pro Wrestling World game. Then there was also Fire Pro Wrestling Returns, which a lot of people, I think myself included, equated to being a New Japan game, and that's something else I didn't think to research in advance, so we're doing that right now. Just, seeing what's up. Was it a New Japan game? Oh, Fire Pro Wrestling World is an official. All right, but it doesn't look like Fire Pro Wrestling Returns was a New Japan game. I gotta do my research sometime. I don't always think of these little things. It's almost like I sit down and I start recording, and I think I've got every note that I could want. And then as I'm talking and sharing, I think of something else. But anyway, New Japan Pro Wrestling, I think, could have released this game in 1996. I think it could have flopped, and I think it would have been okay, because they didn't really even re-enter the video game landscape until Fire Pro Wrestling World. And that game is pretty much, a lot of people still play it, but it's pretty much fizzled out now. So, they don't really have a presence in the video game space. They don't have a lot of presence in North America as it is. They have their New Japan Strong shows, and they have the New Japan Dojo in, I believe, Los Angeles. But that's about it. They don't have a lot of North American positioning otherwise. And I wish they did, because when I do watch New Japan shows, New Japan is an enjoyable event. Earlier this year, I had a super duper bout of insomnia, and it happened to run through the Wrestle Kingdom pay-per-view. And so I stayed up all night long, and I watched every single match. And this was the third Wrestle Kingdom I had watched. First one I had watched live, though. And if I didn't already have insomnia, I think the event would have still kept me up anyway. I think New Japan Pro Wrestling could really do some fun stuff here in the space if they knew how to gain a foothold in North America. And I don't know how they run their business. I can't comment on any of that, but I just look back on this game, Power Move Pro Wrestling, and I wonder what it could have meant for their entry into the North American landscape if they and Activision and Ukes had just rolled the dice and said, to hell with it, we're going for it. We're going to put out a New Japan game on the PlayStation 1, and we're going to just see how it does. I can't imagine Power Move Pro Wrestling did gangbusters for numbers. I bet a New Japan game probably would have did similar, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. But we'll never know. But it's fun, in my mind, to wonder, could releasing a video game in the United States and Canada and Mexico in 1996 have led to shows in any one of those three countries in the 90s, even the 2000s. You know, New Japan is starting to run shows in the United States. I don't think they've run shows in Canada. I think they've been a part of shows in Canada, but no standalone shows. I could be wrong. But, you know, Forbidden Door obviously being one of those events. It was in Toronto this year. But I don't think they've done a standalone New Japan show. And that's why when they're involved in a show, it sells so well. Even those multiverse shows with Impact seem to do pretty well. But what if the games had done well? It could have meant a difference of the wrestling landscape. It could have meant a difference of the Monday Night Wars. It could have meant a difference of who came out on top in the end. It could have meant a difference on so many different fronts. But at the end of the day, what we got was an unlicensed, rebranded, completely original, stripped-down version of... Let's see if I can say it one more time. We'll try it. Toukon Retsuden. I probably still butchered it. We got a stripped-down version of that game. No branding, no nothing. But it was fun. It was basic. It was clunky. But it was fun. I know I spent a lot of time sitting there playing that game because I had enough characters to where I could write it down, make matches, anything that I could make super card matches with back in this era of life. The game was good with me. So Power Move Pro Wrestling maintains a special place in my home, in my heart, in my memory. I love the game. I enjoyed picking it up and playing it. In preparation for recording this, I know that I'll enjoy recording the video that you have been watching while you've been listening to this podcast. You know, basic as all hell. Basic as all hell. Over 58 moves, though. Over 58, probably not over 60. But, you know, whatever. And the other fun thing about this game, too, I had this in my earlier notes, and I wanted to save it till now, and I'm glad I just remembered here before I start wrapping things up. This game was the first in the Retsuden series, which would later become the base for the future SmackDown series. So in a way, this game and the original Retsuden game started paving the road for what would eventually become the SmackDown series, which would later become the SmackDown vs. Raw series. So when you stop and think about it, and maybe you'll say it's a stretch, but this game is almost the foundation of so many of the wrestling games that we love today, because 3D wrestling in 1996 on consoles was basically unheard of. And this game went there. And this game went there before WCW versus the World went there. So maybe Power Move Pro Wrestling deserves a little more respect. And not that I ever see it being disrespected, But I think it needs to be propped up a little bit more, which is why I decided that it needed to be an episode of this podcast. Because this game, it holds fun memories for me, not only because of the unique characters, not only because of how different it was compared to the games we had access to at the time, but the biggest reason that it holds fun memories for me is because it's a game that once I learned more about it, it made it all the more interesting. You know, learning that it was a New Japan game originally, learning that it was essentially the base for the SmackDown games, it just makes this game all the more interesting. And I mean, come on, with a roster that includes names like the Egyptian Conniption and Malibu Mike Swanson and Area 51 and the Commandant, how can you really go wrong? But on that note, my friends, I think that about wraps things up here for our discussion on Power Move Pro Wrestling for the PlayStation 1. You can typically find a copy of it pretty cheap out there if you're ever looking to add it to your PlayStation 1 or your wrestling collection. But either way, I enjoyed revisiting this title, and I hope that you enjoyed my revisiting. Maybe it brought back some memories for you. Maybe it led you to pulling out your PlayStation 1 and, going to town and playing some Power Move Pro Wrestling. But coming up next time here on Dropkicks and Joysticks, Episode 7, we're going to go back to the PlayStation 2 in a game that I hold in a very high regard, but many people do not. And one of the reasons I hold it in high regard is the attention to arena detail. My friends, I'm talking about Showdown Legends of Wrestling. It was the third in the series of the Legends of Wrestling games that had been on the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox. I think the Xbox 360 as well. Can't recall. Don't quote me on that. Never been a Microsoft guy. But it was the third in the series. And it was the most ambitious of the series, as it sought to have the biggest roster and the biggest set of licensed arenas I've ever seen in a wrestling game or any game to this day. But we will talk about that next week here on Dropkicks and Joysticks. But until that time, again, if you'd like to follow me on social media, you can keep up with me in all the different places. And let me tell you to them one more time, we got Twitch, YouTube, X, Twitter, whatever you call it, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, PlayStation Network, Ko-fi, Teespring, and Spotify. All of those, except for Spotify, of course, you can find me at Bloody Bill Vox, and if you're on Spotify, it's Dropkicks and Joysticks. Next week, we cover Showdown Legends of Wrestling. But until then, have a great week out there, my friends, and I will see you next week right here on Dropkicks and Joysticks. See you later.